Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be talking about the start of World War One and the sort of ending of that long 19th century, how it all plays out, how it ends up in this sort of global war, spiraling out of Europe over colonization and empire. And then next time we'll get looking at the end of the war, the Soviet Revolution, some stuff that kind of happens all together in 1918-19. So it's the summer of 1914, and there's this sort of general tension between all these newly forming empires we looked at, all these new nation states we've been looking at, a sort of national rivalry, and this sense of self-determination. Remember, everybody's supposed to be a nation state now. There can't be any more blank spaces on the map, but they're still kind of there. So people are fighting over who gets what. We saw last time when we were looking at imperialism and colonization, the various European forces that are out in Africa or in Southeast Asia kind of competing, America competing in the Pacific, stuff like this. And all of these powers are going to butt up against each other, and eventually it's going to lead to some real chaos in Europe. So this is a really brief outline of World War One. If you're not kind of familiar with it, which is totally fine. It's often taught this way, pretty straightforward in terms of how the steps lay out. It's not so clear cut, but that's just an easy way to kind of keep in mind the overall sort of evolution of it. So in June 1914, this guy, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, is assassinated in Sarajevo by the Black Hand and stuff like this. It's often seen as the beginning of the war. If he hadn't been killed, the war probably would have started anyway. It just would have started somewhere else. There was already a bunch of stuff going on that was sort of pulling people into conflicting, stances. But when he was assassinated, it just kind of triggered a series of events that we'll look at in a second. So pretty quickly things start to unfold. Within about a month and a half there in late July, Russia starts to get ready for war. In August, Germany is going to declare war on Russia. The next day or 2 days later, it declares war on France. A couple days later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia. It's kind of crazy, right? All this stuff fires off really quickly. And so what that's about is all of these European powers had signed these sort of secret treaties and military treaties with each other. Like if country A attacks us, then country B will help defend us from country A. And all these different European states had like entanglements like that. So once things start off, everybody's kind of just drawn into it, whether they want to or not, by these treaties. But pretty quickly, for how fast the war starts, it gets kind of stuck. There's only about a month or maybe 2 months of war where the situation is changing and it's really rapid on the ground. Then after about the middle of September, you start to get this big trench dug basically right across the middle of Europe, and the battle stays there for the rest of the war, more or less. So we'll kind of look at that too. It gets kind of stuck that way for a few years. Things change pretty rapidly in 1917. The US is going to enter the war. Then Russia is going to leave the war. Then in early 1918, there's a pandemic. That's going to have an effect as well. And so by November 1918, the war is going to be over. So you have this sort of 4-year span, and we'll talk about all this just in more depth. It's just kind of a way to kind of think about it and pin some of the dates for you a little bit. So first we'll look at World War I as an imperial war, talk about what that means. Then we'll look at it from the perspective of a global war and talk about what that means. Then we'll look at it from the perspective of total war, which they didn't really use that term at the time, but we'll kind of stretch it back and talk about that a little bit too and see what's happening there. By the way, that's America there. America used to always be depicted as a woman until, sometime around World War II. We'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes up. So World War I was an imperial war. Okay, well, we talked about imperialism and colonization last time a little bit, but what does that mean? Why was it an imperial war? I thought it was just some Europeans killing each other or something, right? Well, it's a lot more complicated. There were all of these sort of rivalries and allies in Europe that were based not just on what was going on in Europe, but also what was going on out in those new colonies, out in that new sort of modern imperial system. I chose this map mostly just for the cartoons, but it does a good job anyway, kind of showing the main powers, right? The allies, the central powers, the sort of neutral powers, although That's a little bit tricky. We'll talk about that. Not everybody who's neutral is totally neutral. Also, down in the bottom right corner there where it says Turkey, it probably shouldn't say Turkey, it should say Ottoman Empire, but that's okay, right? It's still pretty good. So the Triple Alliance, which comes to be called in the US anyway, the Central Powers, was Austria-Hungary, right? That big empire there with the crown on the coat of arms. Germany above it, and then the Ottoman Empire, right, which is down in the corner, not Turkey. Then the Triple Entente, also called the Allies, right, in English in the American version, is Britain, France, and Russia. So you can kind of get a sense of what's there. Also, if you look down there to Serbia, under Austria-Hungary, right, that's where that region is where there was this initial conflict with Francis Ferdinand and stuff like that. So keep this sort of in mind. There's just a general outline of what's happening in Europe. There's all kinds of other stuff going along. You can see like the U.S. right is like pointed out. Well, in 1914, the U.S. isn't involved, right? Stuff like that. So all of these European powers, when they start to fight, another way this is sort of an imperial war is they're using all of the lessons they learned out in their new imperial empires on each other. So we looked at before those new tools that enabled empire, like advanced military weapons or medicine or industrialization. Well, all of those things those troops had been doing in Africa, in Southeast Asia, are going to come back on each other. So the Europeans had learned it's really good to have advanced weaponry, right? Of course. And they had been using it successfully for a while. Things like machine guns, barbed wire, chemical weapons, steam-powered ships that allowed them to get steam upriver into ports and shell port cities, stuff like that. So all of those things out in the empire had created a situation where when the British or the French or the Germans went and tried to exploit their colonies, they tended to have a really quick victory based on offense only. So if you have really superior weapons, you kind of storm in, you shoot everybody. Here's a etching of the British, right, storming into Burma. It's one of the first places that machine guns were used, just on regular people. So the British took machine guns. They had an easy time just mowing down British defenders. It allowed them to colonize Burma really quickly. So a lot of the European imperial mindset was you have all this great new weapons. You hit them hard, you hit them fast. They don't know what's happening. It's just attack all the time until you win. You're not thinking defensively. There's not a sort of complex strategy. You're not thinking about egress routes or supply lines or stuff like that because you don't need to. This led to a certain chauvinism, right? Or chauvinism, right? You can say it either way you want. Amongst these sort of imperial powers, they just felt better than the colonial powers they were fighting against. So the French just felt superior to the Vietnamese, right? And we talked about this a little bit, these ideas of race that were used as a justification for empire, but then also reinforced empire, right, once they come back. So these Europeans often felt like racially or nationalistically or culturally or religiously, they were superior to the other people they were fighting. And that led them generally to have a sort of disdain for their enemy and see the other side as barbarians, unchristian, uncivilized, unadvanced, whatever, right? And that was part of the narrative for why they needed to be there to imperialize them anyway. Wars quickly became seen as really uneven, and that was good. You were there to be victorious very quickly. There wouldn't be like a standoff or anything, and the war would benefit the empire. So here's another depiction of British troops in the Sudan, right? So you can tell by this artwork, you can tell by the sort of way it's laid out, right? Like these people all have swords on the ground, right? The British have modern rifles and sabers and stuff. They're riding horses. The Sudanese are not, stuff like that. So there's this sort of depicting your enemy as a barbarian or uncivilized. You're the best, always thinking and attacking. The problem is when these Europeans are about to go to war in Europe, they all have the same idea. So that could lead to disaster. Also, they're fighting over colonial disputes. the reason that there's all of those entanglements in Europe and these sort of different sides that, have no love lost between them or whatever you want to say, is because they're expanding their empires in places like Africa, right? The Berlin Conference, they just divide up the continent, but in other places like the Pacific Ocean or Southeast Asia, there's real fights over who's going to have what. So all of these different colors on this map sort of show you the different colonial interests, where they're butting up against each other, when they're taking them over. And you can see that there's just a huge mix, right? In Southeast Asia, for example, there's a ton of different colonial ventures right up against each other. You'll also notice that up in Japan, you see some other big pink area there, Manchukuo and stuff like that. That's not going to be colonized until the 1930s. That's sort of part of World War II. Don't worry about that. Nevertheless, the map's pretty good otherwise, sort of showing all the various connections, right, and places where there's sort of friction between these empires. Another thing that was kind of crazy during this time that I think is a little bit different than now, although not entirely, is it was much more common that the public simply demanded war. War was seen as sort of good for the empire. If you always win and you're always superior and it's very, very far away and there's not a tremendous death count that you hear about and stuff like that, you don't see it on TV yet, right? Because that doesn't exist. War was seen as more of a sort of noble endeavor and sort of good for the economy and good for settling disputes, right? It was much more sort of glorified in a way than it is now commonly in the US. And so as tensions rose in Europe, there was actually a lot of calls for war. People thought, good, we'll have a nice little boxing match, we'll have a little dirty, punching each other in the face, and then it'll end really quickly, and we can all get back to business as usual. We can solve the problem and move on. So it wasn't seen necessarily so much as a disaster as it was a legitimate way of solving conflict that would resolve the sort of implications for all of these tensions, right, that were there. This is an interesting sort of propaganda poster, right? Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? So this isn't after the war. This is a piece of propaganda during the war, right? And it's like, what's he going to tell his kids? Well, if he went to war and it was glorious and stuff, he can tell them all about that. He doesn't want to tell them he was in like a college classroom being a big weenie or something, So obviously this is sort of playing on masculinity and stuff, and we'll see a lot of propaganda in a minute. I'll show you some particular gender kind of like this. But the public was often sort of behind these wars, right? So what do I mean when I say it was a global war? Does that mean it was everywhere on Earth? Maybe, but not necessarily. This image is pretty revealing. Here you have troops that are from West Africa, but they're being led by French officers, right? So maybe some weird connections there. So was it a global war, right? We call it World War One. Well, where did most of the fighting happen? Well, the vast majority of the fighting happened along this yellow line running through Central Europe. So just in that sense, this Western Front, it doesn't seem too global in scope. Okay, a bunch of Europeans were fighting each other on this one narrow path right through Europe, right, where they had all dug in along these trenches. That's one way to look at it. But all of these Europeans, remember, had far-flung empires in Latin America, South America, Africa, Asia, right, kind of all over. Australia, right, was part of the British Empire, and all these sorts of things. So all of these European groups are going to bring sort of all of their sort of global access to bear on this one little spot, by and large. So even though most of the fighting is done along this Western Front in trench warfare, you can't sort of count out the global nature of the whole thing. And one aspect you could look at that I already kind of hinted at is the use of colonial troops and labor. So here again in this photograph, you have French officers training or recruiting West African troops. These soldiers would be moved to the front lines, or these soldiers would serve as porters, or these soldiers would defend sort of African colonies, although there wasn't really a lot of fighting out in the colonies between Europeans, so those mostly were sent to Europe to fight. So when you see like World War One movies and World War Two movies, you almost never see like huge groups of Africans and Asians fighting or doing stuff. But indeed, there were. They just kind of get erased from the history. It's a less than proud moment for Europeans in lots of ways. And it sort of wouldn't make sense to a lot of viewers who don't understand the history, so they don't really include that sort of stuff. But hundreds of thousands of soldiers from around the empires were brought to Europe to fight, and this wasn't necessarily the smartest move in the world. So all of these French officers right here are training these West African soldiers to go to Europe and kill other Europeans. When the war's over, if these soldiers live, they go home, right? So now they're back in their colony, but remember, they've been trained to kill white Europeans. Also, colonialism is predicated on this idea of superiority. Well, all of these troops, these colonial troops, are going to go home, and they're going to say, yeah, you know, those Germans and French and British didn't seem so superior to me, maybe. It kind of kills some of the mystique of colonialism, and we'll see that when we get to sort of decolonial movements. A lot of these people that fought in World War One and stuff go home and they still have their weapons, they still have their training, they still have ideas of a bigger world beyond themselves, and that's really dangerous to imperializers. Above, you see a Chinese laborer, right, a porter. Lots and lots of people were taken from southern China and Hong Kong in particular to serve as porters for the British. That just means to carry things around. French troops from Vietnam, stuff like that. So you get actually a lot of troops from East Asia as well that are not involved in the fighting per se. They're more on the labor side of the war, but critical to the war effort nonetheless. So what else is going on outside of Europe? Strangely, Japan and China are going to have a little bit of scuffle. And if you're familiar with like World War II and stuff, this is somewhat related, somewhat unrelated. Here you have a political cartoon, Jap the Giant Killer. On the shield, the guy who's laying down is supposed to be China, right? And on his shield it says King, and there's a Japanese guy, you know, getting ready to kill the king, right? That was China. So strangely, the war is happening in Europe, and there's all these European forces fighting each other. In the midst of that, Japan is going to attack Germany's colonies in China, and they're going to kind of play it off as part of the war. But really, Japan wanted to expand in China. Germany was fighting in Europe, and they saw an opportunity to attack those colonies. They were really undefended, and make the claim that, hey, man, we're one of the allies. We're attacking Germany. We're helping out. They also took over some islands in the Pacific that had been German colonies, and sort of invade China a little bit in the process. China was neutral, right, in the war. So by January 1915, Japan does something really interesting. The politicians and the military leaders in Japan issue this document called the 21 Demands to China. And they're worried that after the war is over, maybe they're not going to get to keep these German colonies, or maybe they're not going to get what they want. So they present these demands to China thinking, we'll get a couple of them. You know, maybe it's for money, maybe it's for resources, maybe it's for land, contract deals, stuff like that. And then, you know, we'll be satisfied if we only get a couple of these and the war ends, we'll have some sort of documentation that we should keep them. As it turns out, the Japanese government was kind of in trouble. There was a new republic in China, right? It started in 1912, the only sort of free democratic republic in China that has existed. And here they were only 3 years old, and Japan was invading them, or not even 2 years old, and Japan had invaded them. So they cave really quickly. And officially, China agrees to all of the demands, which are pretty crazy set of sort of treaty demands. But remember, this was more of a thing in China already. We'd seen these unequal treaties and stuff, so this has been going on for about 50 or 60 years already. It's not too important that you know what those were or anything, but that's just the Japanese really pushed for a lot out of China, and strangely, they kind of got it. But when the war is over, the Allies are going to repeal most of that, which is going to piss off Japan. So we'll get to that too, kind of maybe next time. So how does the US get into the war? The US was a big neutral power. It's very far away, right in North America. How did it come to be part of World War One and intervene? Well, it's kind of a weird story because in a lot of ways, it wasn't inevitable that the US would participate, and it wasn't clear whose side the US would be on. In 1914, most Americans didn't want to go to war when the war starts. This is often said to be part of America's isolationism or isolationist tendencies. Whenever you see that, that's garbage. That's something people say because it's a nice sort of convenient catch-all. Some Americans were very excited about internationalism, others weren't. Some were conservative, some were more liberal. Also, America was intervening in foreign politics all the time in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, or even as just they expanded across the continent. So that idea of isolationism it's old and it's like a stereotype that doesn't actually really hold up. Anywho, another reason was lots of Americans had German ancestry, right? Germans, one of the biggest groups of immigrants to come to the United States. So at this point in 1914, there were still whole towns in the Midwest that spoke German, where they had immigrated and they had never learned English because there was no national language, obviously, and this is why people in the Midwest still have a different accent, like and all that sort of stuff, right? So it was unclear who they would support or how that support would be given. But some events start to happen that shape the sort of US consciousness, not only towards war, but towards being part of the Allies, right? So in May 1915, a ship gets sunk by the Germans, the Lusitania. So here it is, here's an image of it being sunk. And when this ship gets sunk, 128 US civilians die that were on it. This was a ship that went back and forth between Ireland, Britain, and the United States, kind of like a cargo ship in some ways, but mostly kind of a luxury liner ship. Remember, there's no airplanes yet, so this is the only way you can get back and forth across the Atlantic or something like that. So when that happens, in the US, it's depicted as this absolute tragedy. These crazy Germans had just shot down or sunk this boat that was filled with civilians and was like, not a threat to anybody, and it proved that the Germans were crazy. But what didn't make the newspapers at the time was the reason the Germans sunk it was because the United States was using it to illegally sell arms to Britain. We were hiding weapons on it because we thought it would be a good cover, because it was like a kind of a cruise line ship and a basic cargo ship. Nobody would suspect we were putting weapons on it, but the Germans had figured out we were smuggling weapons on it. That's why they sunk it. So that didn't really make the paper, right? People got pissed off. They thought the Germans were just killing civilians, but the whole reason they did that was maybe because of the U.S. actions ahead of time. Over the next year or two, 1915, 1916, the US economy begins to drop quite a bit because the main exports were to Europe. Well, all of Europe's in war. And so Europeans aren't going to be buying our movies and cars and steel and other things we were producing for international consumption if they couldn't afford it. And the war made everything more expensive, right? It made things harder to come by. All the countries in Europe kind of had to tighten their belts, and any resources they had would be directed at fighting the war, not at commercial economies. But there was an exception. The British Empire was the biggest in the world, and it had lots and lots of money, and it could continue to buy things from the United States, particularly weapons and food. But even the British Empire is going to start to wear thin a little bit, and by 1917, the Allies, the British in particular, owed the Americans huge amounts of debt. So they had been borrowing money for weapons, they had been borrowing money for food, even though they had paid through an awful lot. And the U.S., not just the government, but some citizens, right, wealthier citizens, were now heavily invested in the Allies, and the Allies owed them lots and lots of debt. Well, what happens if the Allies lose the war? We would never have gotten the money back. So there's a sort of economic incentive as well. So here's a political cartoon from the time. Uncle Sam here, peace on earth, goodwill towards men, but on his back, war ammunition for sale, orders filled promptly, right? Yeah, so people were critical of this. The US said we were neutral, right? Pretended to be neutral. However, continued to sell weapons. It's hard to be neutral if you're giving one side weapons, right? But one of the things that was the direct push for war was the Zimmermann telegraph. This also happened in 1917. Here in this political cartoon, it's called the Zimmermann Note, and it's blowing up in the Kaiser's face. Basically, what happened was the Germans got this great idea. They could secretly get in contact with Mexico, and they would ask the Mexican government to attack the United States from the south. If the Mexican government did that, Mexico at the time had a really big, strong military, then that would sort of detain the Americans, keep them out of the war in Europe. The Germans would hopefully win the Central Powers, and then they had promised that Mexico could keep, California, New Mexico, Arizona, these places that had been taken by the US in the Mexican-American War, and sort of be retribution for Mexico. But the Germans' message was intercepted by British intelligence, and which was kind of a whole new thing, right? These ideas of intelligence and propaganda and like signal services and sort of espionage and stuff. The British found out, and they informed their American counterparts that Germany had sent this message to Mexico. So before the message even got there, the British government and the American government knew. So Mexico, of course, they take the message and they wave it around and they say, oh my God, we would never have done this. It's completely impossible. What a horrible idea. Actually, a lot of Mexicans were thinking about it, right? If it had stayed secret, maybe it would have been more of an idea. Remember, America had invaded Mexico several times, had just been chaotically engaged with war against Mexico and treated Mexican citizens pretty horribly. So there was some maybe ideas floating around in the Mexican military or government that this might have been a good idea, but as soon as it's public, the smart idea is to say, no way, never. It kind of shores you up with the US and makes Germany look bad. So when this became public knowledge, that was it. The president of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, kind of compiles all this stuff together and says, look, now Germany's coming after us. We better go after them before they actually attack us, before they make good on this. So Wilson goes in front of Congress and asks to go to war. The president used to have to do that. The president no longer has to do that, right? The president can declare war, I think, for 90 days without getting approval from Congress. And then after that, you just say, well, it's not a war anyway. It's a police action or it's an anti-terrorist, whatever. So pretty tricky. Anywho, that's the official sort of start of American intervention in World War I. So World War I was also an early version of total war. So total war is kind of a tricky term, but we'll get to it. Here you see this poster, Wake Up America, Civilization Calls Every Man, Woman, and Child. And that's kind of the idea of it. So in total war, it means the mass mobilization of the entire nation state towards wartime efforts. This term is first coined actually in Nazi Germany later, right, in the build up to World War II. But the idea, you can kind of extend it back in time. It means that no matter who you are, no matter what you do, you're a part of the war effort. The whole state has been mobilized, right? So we have these new nation states that have that, remember, the certain container, right? They have borders. Everybody inside feels German, Japanese, South African, whatever. And so in total war, the whole entity, the whole sort of geo body is mobilized for war. So what does that look like? Well, it means that war can be a lot more destructive and chaotic. You're not just fighting over something, you're fighting for the survival of your particular nation state, or you're fighting for the survival of your race, right? So the stakes get a lot higher. So in World War I, you see this level of sort of death and destruction that nobody had ever seen before. It's partially based on those ideas and partially based on all the new advanced technology. And a lot of this takes place in trench warfare. So here's a picture of some trenches during the fighting. This might be a German trench, actually, because it's pretty nice. The Germans had nicer trenches. You see some people sleeping. I don't think those people are probably dead, right? They're probably just sleeping back there. You're down, kind of carved into the ground, and about anywhere from 100 feet away to a mile away, there's another trench just like this, filled with the other soldiers. And every once in a while, you poke your head up and shoot at them, or every once in a while, you try to lob a bomb far enough, or every once in a while, your whole regiment is ordered to come up out of the trench and try to run over to the other side and get into their trench. That space in between was known as no man's land. It was all filled with barbed wire and horrible little methods for killing people, one of which was chemical weapons, which is a new sort of invention during this time, in particular mustard gas. Mustard gas is really easy to make, two very common household chemicals. It accidentally gets made in people's houses all the time when they're cleaning or trying to unclog a toilet. Plumbers get exposed to mustard gas pretty regularly, actually. When you mix these two chemicals together, you get this kind of foggy gas that emerges that if you breathe it in can really damage your lungs or your eyes. It can temporarily blind you. It can burn your lungs pretty severely. It can knock you unconscious. So now you got to deal with that too. Also, it's heavier than air. So if a canister of mustard gas gets like in the trench, it'll kind of fill up the trench, right? So people are wearing gas masks sometimes, all these sorts of things. Also, you see the introduction of new war machines like tanks and airplanes. However, neither of these are pretty good yet for war. So tanks at this point were mostly just kind of like an armored car, and their primary use was to sort of drive through no man's land and like scrape up all that barbed wire and provide kind of a shield for your soldiers to get to the other side. Airplanes were still made of wood. They were still primarily single engine and two wings like biplanes. Remember, airplanes had only been invented pretty recently, right? I think 1914 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. You get the Wright brothers making those airplanes. So airplanes were pretty new. They were made from light wood. You don't want to be making, big trips in something made of wood when people are shooting at you, for example. So they didn't have a lot of war applications yet. They were mostly used for reconnaissance, so you could fly high enough, but you could still see down and you could see where troops were stationed or where the trenches were, stuff like that. Really, it's World War II. They're going to become really, crazy useful. Also, because the whole nation is mobilized for war, it means that anybody in that nation is kind of fair game. So it's not just soldiers fighting soldiers. If the whole sort of nation state is fighting the war, everybody's a legitimate target. If you can blow up a factory that's making bullets, for example, you're winning the war, right? And it doesn't matter that that factory is filled with women and children who are making, the shells. They're not soldiers, they're civilians, but if you kill them, if you blow up the factory, you're preventing them from doing their job, from helping that nation to win the war. So it means civilian targets are more okay, which kind of had been less, at least morally acceptable. I mean, obviously people had done it before in wars and everything. Civilian targets had always been in danger, but this provided a sort of new justification for destroying enemy civilians or infrastructure, roads, buildings, stuff like that. And all of this led to incredibly high death rates during World War I, unlike anybody had ever seen before. The amount of collateral damage, the amount of death was staggering. During the war, 8.5 million soldiers die at least. There's probably 21 million military casualties, right? So people who are wounded bad enough to be taken off the battlefield or taken out of the war in general, and millions of civilians die. And due to sort of incomplete population data or not very good records being kept, not, at the time, census and surveys weren't nearly as good as they are now. There were no electronic records of keeping track of these people. It was simply hard to know, but whole towns get wiped off the face of the earth. Sometimes these trenches end up going through cities. So the level of destruction is just absolutely incredible. This graph does a pretty good job sort of showing how that plays out in terms of military versus civilian deaths. So as you can see, that remember that the Triple Entente, right, is the allies, as we call them, the Central Powers is the sort of bad guys from the American perspective, right, of Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. So as you can see, for the Allies, military deaths make up about 36% of all the dead. but Allied deaths that are civilians, about 20% of the total. For the Central Powers, it's more evenly split. About half of all the deaths for the Central Powers are civilian and about half are military. This is an incredible amount when you compare this to wars where it's primarily soldiers fighting. You can see that, so maybe 45% of all the deaths were civilians. It's just incredibly high. So I don't normally show a lot of videos from the History Channel or whatever, right? You got to watch out for that because, you know, aliens and all. But this next little clip is actually really good about what trench warfare was like, and there's a lot of historians in it who sort of comment, and some sort of recreation video footage that shows what the daily life was like in these trenches to give you a sense of how that actually played out. So let's check that out, and then we'll get back to it.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire.
Incoming! The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
So a pretty good, yeah, description there of kind of what trench warfare was like, how it looked, what life was like for soldiers in the trenches. It was all really horrible. But back home, things were not great all the time either. um, During total war, you get the development of what comes to be called the home front. So you have the front where actually all the fighting is, but the home front means back in the home nation where the war is not going on, but where everybody in society is articulating their whole lives towards the winning of the war. And this leads to people making a lot of choices about their day-to-day activities to support the war. It leads towards conflict at home, all kinds of things like that, and changes a lot of policies. So, for example, during this time in America, right, is when prohibition becomes more and more on the table. Well, it turns out that most of the brewing in the United States is done by Germans. America is going to go to war with Germany. So you start to get images like this. If this town goes dry, us Germans will hang together. It's making fun of the way Germans talk. It shows that brewery in the background. So if you want to kill Germans, vote against alcohol, right? It's pretty weird and sort of racist in a strange way. It's anti-German. This is when the US is going to start to get those sorts of sentiments and demand that everybody be educated in English and all this sort of stuff that they didn't before. Or you could look at this other poster, right? Join the United States School Garden Army, right? So even if you're at school as a kid, you can't be a soldier, you can't go fight, you're too young to work in the factory making bullets or whatever. But even still, you can participate in the war by growing a garden at your school and eating those foods rather than buying foods on the market. This plays into that idea of rationing, which we'll look at too in a second. So the home front kind of can't be emphasized enough because everybody's going to get drawn into it. And particularly as we get into like World War II, this becomes even more and more apparent. But this is kind of weird from an American perspective today because for the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years, Americans have participated in lots of wars. But we haven't really had this mentality. People haven't really had to give up very much. We're currently fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. But unless you're a veteran or unless you're actually in the military, you probably didn't give up a lot. It did change your reasoning. There was a lot of more anti-Muslim bias over the last 20 years, for example. But it's not like gas prices were crazy. It's not like you had to grow all your own food, stuff like that. So this is a really extreme version of that, as these pictures point out, right? So these are all propaganda posters from the war. So here you have this woman saying, of course I can. It's a double entendre, right? She can do it, and she's also making cans, right? She's canning. I'm patriotic as can be, rationing won't bother me, right? Save the wheat, help the fleet, eat less bread. Okay, we're saving you, you save the food, right? So the idea is you should eat less, you should preserve food, you should grow your own food, because the war's on, you got to feed all those soldiers. The more soldiers you can feed, the better they are, the more they'll be successful. Why should you save wheat, right? Well, wheat is pretty good in that it really doesn't go bad in terms of nutritional value, I suppose. If you've ever had like old wheat or old flour that you took out of the cabinet and you used to like make cookies, when you actually make the dough, it'll kind of smell funny if it's really old flour. But once you bake the cookies, it's fine. You can eat them. You wouldn't really know. So wheat holds up really well. It's easy to pack, easy to ship. So maybe instead you would do things like eat corn or beans or something like that. That isn't the same. And you grow a big garden over the summer. You can save all those tomatoes and radishes and whatever else, and then you can eat those. During the year, you don't have to eat as much other food that can be sent to the soldiers. So you're really asking people in the city, you're asking people back on the farm to be part of the war, even though they're not on the front lines, which was pretty different sort of than previous versions of warfare or the way people interacted in these situations. And those posters, and we're going to look at more of them, are all examples of propaganda. which you didn't really have so much of before the war. So remember, now we have this new thing, these new nation states, and the government works for the people. But the government's going to war. So the government has to convince the people to be part of the war. Sometimes there's public demand for it, but other times the government or the military has to try to convince people to join up, to fight. How do you convince a young American kid who grew up in a town that, lots of German people, to go shoot Germans in the head? Right? You have to, that's not a natural thing. You have to convince them to do that. You have to teach them to kill. You have to teach them to hate somebody else. And so you do that through propaganda. And governments are going to get really good at this really quickly. It's going to be a relatively new thing, and now it's just completely sewn into our media and stuff that we consume all the time. But here you go, beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. That's an American propaganda poster to have you buy Liberty bonds, basically give more money to the government, like an additional tax, basically to help fight the war. So here you have the Hun, which is really funny because Huns actually were like from the sort of Central Asian steppe. They were Asians that were fighting Europeans. Here they're depicting Germans and Austrians as Huns. That's kind of weird. They're also all in black and like covered in blood, like in this destroyed city. So you're like kind of racializing the enemy. They're kind of in dark. They're kind of bloody. They're certainly like evil, right? Because remember, you're trying to convince people to give money to support the state, to join the military, things like that. Here's another one. This is a German poster, right? Also for bonds. It says "End you," right? And here's a German getting ready to throw his percussion grenade there through the trench. And it's asking for money for bonds, right? For you to like donate your money to the war effort. The empire needs men. The overseas states, helped by the young lions, the old lion defeats its foes. What is that about? That's weird. Well, these were propaganda posters that were put up in Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, depicting Britain as like the main lion, and all these other like white outposts of British power were like the young lions or the new cubs or something like that, and that Britain was in trouble and they should all sort of answer the call, even if they were Australian, to go fight in the Mediterranean or something like that. Destroy this mad brute, enlist in the US Army. This is a super classic poster. People put it up in like college dorm rooms and stuff all the time. It's really got it all going on in terms of propaganda value. In the back, there's Europe that's all burnt. This villain is now in America, right? He's crossed the Atlantic. He has a club that says culture, and it's got like people's brains and stuff all over it, like he's been killing zombies. He's raping this white woman. He's also not a human being. He's an animal. He's like a black gorilla. So here you have Americans depicting the Germans as like a black gorilla raping a white woman with this club that says culture, right? Because Europe's supposed to be like the cultural capital, but really it's like used to club people's brains out. And he's coming for you, right? Unless you enlist in the US Army, then you can go and kill this guy before he gets here. It's pretty extreme. It's pretty wild. But it's not anything. I mean, we're going to see stuff like this again for World War II. You can see stuff up like this today. It's gotten a bit more subtle for sure. But really the height of wartime feeling where you're trying to convince, the average person to get invested in the war, whether, with their money or with their effort, or in this case, literally like joining the military, right? And you can often use women, or you can often use sort of racial ideas to help you along in this propaganda. In fact, gender is one of the best ways, right, to engage in propaganda and convince people to join the military or tell people what their proper role is within war. So here you have a poster, "Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy." Be a man and do it. Well, what's the saying? If you don't join the Navy, you're not a man. Even women wish they were men so they could do this, right? That's weird. I'm not sure there were a ton of women wishing they were men so they could join the Navy to go to war or whatever, but hey, that's okay. Sow the seeds of victory, plant and raise your own vegetables, right? So here, remember, America, again, is often a woman. And here you have America, like, throwing seed out and stuff. So, If you're a woman and you can't go and fight, well, the next best thing you can do is put on a sundress and go raise some vegetables, right? You can still help with the war. Get behind the girl he left behind him. It's a great double entendre. I don't think they meant, but hey, whatever. Join the land army. So if you're like a 60-year-old guy and you can't go fight or whatever, well, hey, you can still stay home with the other housewives and stuff who had to stay behind for the war effort, and you can grow vegetables and you can like help overall. Kind of a weird idea. I think modern sentiment now wouldn't fly, but still at the time it's okay. It's up to you. Protect the nation's honor. Enlist now. This one's a little complicated. So there's Uncle Sam. He's pointing at you. He wants you to help, enlist and protect the country's honor. Here you have a woman who's dressed in white. It looks like she's wearing like a bridal gown. White dresses, bridal gowns associated with virginity. She's kind of draped in the flag. What are you protecting? Why are you joining up, right? You're joining up to protect the nation's honor, right? These phrasings are definitely tied to virginity, and it's very weird, right? But it has a certain propaganda value. If you're a young man that's really excited about joining the military or something, seeing something like this might really help you in that direction. Or if you have certain religious beliefs or beliefs about women needing protection, right? This can really play into those ideas. The United States Army builds men. You got crafts, character, physique. Apply at the nearest recruiting office. This is still a good recruiting pitch, right? Like, join the Army, learn a career, get buff, become a good, upstanding citizen. Really, they just want you to go fight in a trench. But it's a good sort of pitch to young men coming out of school that don't necessarily have any other plans, don't necessarily want to go to college. And it's still true. I mean, the Army is actually a great career, or the military. If you end up having no place to be, dropping out of college, join the military. There's nothing wrong with it. It's great. It definitely has propelled hundreds of thousands of Americans into the middle class. But in this case, it's definitely playing on the idea of gender. And again, if you're going to be a real man, right, you should do it. This next one, for the glory of Ireland, will you go or must I, right? So that's the Lusitania being sunk in the background there, and an Irish woman picking up her rifle, ready to go to war. If you're just a lazy Irish man, your women have to do your fighting for you and stuff. Like, be a man, go defend Ireland, right? So playing on these concepts of gender and what it means is a great sort of propaganda tool. Just a couple more. It's nice in the surf, but what about all the men in the trenches? Go and help. So this is from Australia, right? So if you're just laying around surfing, enjoying your life, you're not a good man, right? You need to go kill. You need to get over to the Mediterranean. And actually, a lot of Australian soldiers have a pretty rough time during World War One. They're going to get kind of abandoned fighting against the Ottoman Empire and stuff. This other one's a little tricky. When you know you're not forgotten by the girl, you can't forget, right? So what are men supposed to do? They're supposed to go and they're supposed to join the war and fight for their country. What are good women supposed to do? Well, we already saw they're supposed to grow gardens and sow seeds and stuff. But also, they're supposed to just sit around and wait for you for 4 years, right? They're supposed to stay home in their silky nightie there and just kind of wait for you to get back because they're so in love with you and all. Okay, like maybe that's a thing, maybe it's not. But it's kind of bizarre, right? They're like roses fade and stuff, but the love is going to stay forever. It's like, yeah, but you're also kind of breaking apart lots of families and lots of couples and stuff like this for the war. And it's not entirely clear that's great, but you can put this kind of rosy romantic spin on it, like this is what a woman should do, which is really problematic, right? These depictions of men and women are definitely just being used to play on people's emotions, to convince them to act in certain ways during the war. And this has not gone anywhere. When college recruiters or when military recruiters go to high schools and stuff, they use all of these same tactics, all that sort of thing. Well, the other thing that makes it really weird, particularly the stuff about women, is what were women actually doing during the war? Well, you think about, okay, so you scrape off 1 million men out of country A and send them to go fight. Well, all those men were doing jobs, by and large. They were working in factories, they were working on the farm, they were working in, mom and pop shops, they were selling things, they were working in mines, they were teachers, lawyers, doctors, all that sort of stuff. So what happens to those jobs? Well, women start doing them out of necessity. So here you have some pictures of a woman packing shells, right, in a munitions factory, and you have women moving what looks to be either coal or maybe moving around concrete fill, right, for construction. So far from just kind of hanging out wearing sundresses and like pining for their lover or whatever, women definitely participated in the wartime economy. They stepped in, they started to do the jobs that were left behind just out of necessity, right? They had to. And it wasn't necessarily part of a women's movement or anything like that. It was just what was happening because the nation was on this sort of wartime footing. But it is an early taste of these sorts of independence movements and women's rights movements. These women, for the first time, may have had a paycheck. They may have been in the workforce. They may have been leaving the house every day to participate in something that gave them a sense of purpose beyond their particular household or their neighborhood community. And after the war, this goes away really quickly. Most of these women are back either. Well, there's always a division, right? If you're a poor woman, you've always had to work. That's been just true, whatever. But if you were a middle class woman in the US or Britain or other places, you didn't work. And so that was sort of a big change. And we're going to see, particularly as World War I comes around, or when World War I kind of comes to an end in the 1920s and 30s, there's going to be more and more of these movements culminating maybe after World War II. So we'll kind of see that coming down the line. All right, so keep reading on this stuff. Try to get just all kind of caught up with that. There's a little section from the writings of Lenin for next time that's available online. You can just check that out. And next time we're going to talk about the ending of the war and the Soviet Revolution and how those things kind of come together and what it looks like. So let me know what questions you have. Talk to you next time.